Well, welcome back to the Anti-War Room. I'm here with Erik Lever of the Institute for Policy Studies. And Erik, thanks once again for all your work. Erik is normally on the other side of the camera, everybody. And every once in a while we like to bring him on this side of the camera because he's very insightful. He really knows a lot about this process and what's going on. And so, Erik, it's great that you're on this side.
Thanks for having me.
It is the Friday, the 20th day of April. We're on the eve of a very big week next week. And for those of you who don't follow this all that closely, which I am assuming is most of you, this is where the process can get very, very interesting. Yesterday, the House of Representatives appointed their conferees to the conference committee that will make the decision, that will meet House members and Senate members, that will meet about the disagreement between both of their versions of the supplemental appropriation. The House version, of course, establishes benchmarks and two sets of time frames, depending upon if the Iraqi government meets these benchmarks, but sets a date certain in 2008 for the withdrawal of our troops, regardless of what happens to the benchmarks. March of 2008. The Senate, on the other hand, says that we should begin the process 120 days after the passage of the bill. That is, troops must begin to be withdrawn 120 days after passage of the supplemental, but sets as a goal the completion of that process in the spring. So those are, and there are obviously different other aspects of the bills, but in terms of getting out of Iraq, those are the two essential differences between those versions. Is that right?
Exactly, that's right.
So now the conference. Now that we have these different versions. We now sit. The committee sits in a conference, which will happen next week. And by the way, I used to be on the Armed Services Committee. I've sat in these conferences, and believe me, much of this is being worked out. If it hasn't already been worked out, the staff does a lot of the legwork. The leadership sits down and does their thing, and then they basically tell the people they've appointed to the conference, what's going to happen. With the exception, of course, of the Senate side and Senator Ben Nelson of Nebraska, who's an appropriator on the Appropriations Committee, that is on this committee, and he has made it very clear that he will oppose any dates certain coming out of that conference committee. So, or he won't support it. And if Ben Nelson does not support it, then the bill doesn't even emerge from this committee. Why? Because of the numbers. The Democrats are going to need every single one of them to be voting for their package, or it doesn't get out of committee. So, for those of you taking civics, if they can't come to a resolution, the bill dies in committee, doesn't even get out of the committee. Comes out of committee, it then goes first to the floor of the House. And here's the other interesting element of this dimension. Comes back to the House. If Ben Nelson gets his way in the conference committee and eliminates a date certain for the bill that goes on to the floor of the House, some of the progressive members of Congress, who very begrudgingly voted in favor of the date certain that was set in the original House bill, have begun talking about the fact that they would oppose anything that doesn't include at least some kind of date certain. So the second possibility, of course, it gets to the House floor, with Ben Nelson getting his way, and the House could vote it down, and it never moves on to the Senate, and it would die in the House. If it's successful, if Speaker Pelosi and the Democrats can keep their coalition together, goes over to the Senate, and Majority Leader Reid is able to keep his caucus together, then it goes to the president's desk. And when will what's the time frame on this, Erik? When will all of this likely happen?
Well, I think that the supposition is that it will get out of conference committee, it will get voted out of the House and the Senate, and then the president would veto it. But, the timing is pretty unclear. It seems that the conference committee should be in the middle of next week reporting out, which would then bring it in the following week. So the last week of the month would be when both bodies would vote on final approval. Then it would go to the president. He would immediately veto it. So then we essentially have the month of May to work with on trying to figure out what the alternative package will be, since most of the House leadership has said that they would want to have a funding package by the end of the month. The Congressional Research Service estimates that there's enough money in the pipeline to go a little bit longer than that, maybe till early July. But there is now some real pressure that's being played on the military because that they're having to borrow this money from other accounts and that sort of stuff. So this was a high pressure cooker situation already. As soon as the president vetoes it, it's going to get kicked up a couple more notches.
Wow. Okay. So next week, the week of what would that be, the 22nd, or 23rd would be the week of the conference committee. The week of the April 30th and the first week of May would be the week that the House and Senate vote on that conference committee report. And then the president vetoes it. And then supposedly the clock will start ticking as to when they can come up with a new bill, which means that goes right back to the appropriations committees, House and Senate. They have to work up a new supplemental bill. They have to put it on the floor, first vote it out, put it on the floor of the House, put it on the floor of the Senate, and we're right back to where we're. Right. Then another reconciliation, and all of that has to be done according to what we're hearing, at least their time frame that they're talking about, by the 1st of June. That's not a lot of time.
It's not, especially when you remember that the president first, sent this request for funding. I think it was the very first week of April. I'm sorry, of February. So
yes.
We've had March, April, May, essentially. So you're going to be trying to compact 3 months of work into 1 month.
Yeah, boy. It's amazing how so often in the legislative process, this is how this works. The tough decisions are made under incredible duress, incredible time pressure, and really at the very last minute. And obviously this is no exception. Meanwhile, back at the ranch, the news from Iraq continues to get worse and worse and worse by the day. This week we have seen some of the worst bombings and killings that we have seen since the beginning of certainly of the so-called escalation or surge, if not the war itself. We also now see that not only are the bombings increasing, but now the number of murdered people that have been discovered that obviously have been assassinated, those numbers are increasing in Baghdad. So we had originally a reduction in some of the violence in Baghdad and an escalation of the violence outside of Baghdad. Now we're seeing an escalation of violence both inside and outside Baghdad. And the pressure, and what's happening within this country, of course, is that as the polls are showing, Americans are getting more and more frustrated with this war, less and less confident in this president's policy, and subsequently, I would think, more and more pressure on members of Congress.
That's got to be the case. I mean, you look at the poll numbers for the president, and he's been campaigning virtually every day while members have been on recess, being out and about, saying how any sort of withdrawal or setting any sort of benchmarks is, detrimental to his cause. And even while he's been, on the stump, his numbers continue to drop. So it's like every time that he opens his mouth, his ratings continue to plummet on this. Now, on the other hand, Democrats' numbers haven't really improved on how the public perceives them of handling the situation in Iraq. So, I think that's why May is going to become so critical, because they're going to have to show, what their plan is, put it out on the table, and I think actually do what the public really wanted them to do, which was to actually have a bill that's just going to be able to bring the troops home. I think that some of the way that the supplemental was handled had some sleight of hand maneuvering in it, a lot of backdoor dealings. The public didn't really buy into that, and I think that now it's time to lay the cards on the table. Are we going to accept war for the continuation of this president's term in office, or are we going to put a stop to it? And I think that now we have a great chance to try to do that.
Fantastic. Well, the pressure is building, obviously, just about everywhere, but not enough. This president is extremely stubborn, as everyone knows. But it basically becomes a political pressure question. And everyone in the Senate, of course, in the House, it's not lost on any politician in this country to see what's happening to John McCain and why it's happening. His numbers are just plummeting, and of course the reason for that is his support for the war in Iraq and the escalation. And he has continued to talk more. He figures he's going to double down and make a point out of pushing for support for the war. I think in part because the Republicans, particularly those who are going to be voting in these primaries, still support supposedly the war. But nonetheless, it isn't working, and his numbers are going down, and it's not lost on other Republican colleagues.
Well, and you had mentioned in the supplemental that when it comes back for a vote, that if it's weakened, that a lot of the hard anti-war folks in Congress might not vote for it. But you then have the opportunity for more of the moderate Republicans to come on board, and for them to say, like, to go back home and tell their constituents, well, I couldn't even support something that had goals for withdrawal, I think it makes it really tough for them, especially, when you look at where the whole country is on the question of the war right now. So.
Absolutely. And, we're doing, Win Without War is doing some polling in some of these states like Maine, for example, and we're going to be releasing the results of that poll next week. But we're finding that certainly in Maine's case, our delegation, at least our Senate delegation, is certainly out of step with where Maine people are. And, of course, it comes down to, okay, you've got to make a decision. Who are you representing? The views and interests of your people at home, or the views and interests of the President of the United States? And, of course, there are enormous pressure on these senators by the White House, by the Republicans, to toe the line. And the question is, will the pressure from the folks at home overcome this pressure cooker, political partisan pressure cooker in Washington? And that's going to determine what we do in Iraq. And I would hope that all of us just keep this pressure up, because this is a critical time. This week, next week, the following week, this is the window where focused pressure is going to do a lot of good. And keep those cards, letters, phone calls, and visits coming.
Yeah, it's important to remember that, there's over $100 billion on the line for adding more for the war. And, now is the time to be speaking up and speaking out against that.
Well, okay, a big week coming up, followed by another big week. We're going to keep you informed as much as we can. We'll be back here next week with an update. Erik Lever, thank you very much. I'm Tom Andrews for the Anti-War Room. Thanks for tuning in.